Hello and welcome to yet another session of In Dialogue Foundation Certificate Course in Dialogue Studies 2024-2025. Today we have the pleasure of having with us Professor Aditya Nigam, who would be speaking on postmodernity, dialogue, and the quest for universalism. Professor Aditya Nigam is a political theorist at the Center of Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi. His recent work has been concerned with the decolonization of social and political theory. He has earlier worked on ideological and discursive formations and the relationship to the constitution of political subjectivities. In particular, his interest lies in theorizing the contemporary experience of politics, populism, and democracy in the non-West, treating the non-West as the ground for doing theory rather than a field for application or testing of standard frameworks derived from the Western experience. A parallel and related part of Dr. Nigam's work has been concerned with interrogating the received philosophical history of capital, once again from the vantage points of the experiences of India and the non-West in general. Professor Nigam also works with the CSDS's Indian Languages Program and its Hindi journal Pratiman. He comments regularly on contemporary politics issues on the blog Kafila.online. He is the author of The Insurrection of Little Selves, The Crisis of Secular Nationalism in India, Power and Contestation, India since 1989, with Nivedita Menon, After Utopia, Modernity, Socialism, and the Postcolony, and Desire Named Development. Professor Nigam, you have up to 2 hours for the session. You may leave as much time for questions and discussions as you like. Sir, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I must make a small correction here. I actually am no longer part of CSDS. I retired a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And so a little bit of that working with the Indian language program, etc., is not exactly anymore true. And so, yes, I will start right away. And I think I'll try to kind of keep it around between 50 and 60 minutes. And then we can have a discussion around various issues. Yeah, I would like to thank Mr. Berzad Fatmi for the invitation to deliver this lecture. I'm delighted to be able to share some of my reflections with you and the esteemed participants. In what follows, I want to address some of the questions posed by postmodernity, if we see it as a condition that has become pervasive in our times of the crisis of modern universalism. Indeed, the crisis of modernity as such. But it is not just the problems posed by postmodernity as a condition that I wish to address here. Equally, I will try to do so with reference to the intellectual challenge posed by what is often called postmodernism, but in common parlance refers to a complex intellectual formation that goes by the name of post-structuralism, or broadly recognized as post-structuralism or referred to as post-structuralism in the academy. And so before we start discussing the problem at hand, namely dialogue and conversation, I should like to say a few words about postmodernity and postmodernism and the challenge posed by them for matters of our concern, i.e. dialogue today. By postmodernity, I mean, of course, the condition that the crisis of modernity's vision of emancipation through universalisms. Now, in case you find any of these words or terms, you need a clarification or anything, I mean, we can take them up at discussion time also. But I don't know what the format of the organizers is, but I'm happy to actually even respond if you raise questions in between. So that is to say, by crisis of modernity's vision of emancipation through universalisms, that is to say, by relying on certain values that are supposedly common to all of humanity. It was through Europe that we understand what we understand as modernity achieved its currently existing form. Until very recently, it was seen as the only way to be in the new times. It was argued that even though all humans may not have attained to an awareness of those values that Europe, through its enlightenment, had acquired, all humans were capable of attaining to a similar enlightenment and transcending their cultural limitations. It's a bit like Plato's famous allegory of the cave, which in itself is a dialogue between Socrates and Plato's brother Glaucon. In this dialogue, Socrates asks Glaucon to imagine a cave where people are held prisoners inside with their backs turned to the outside. These prisoners are chained in a way where they cannot turn their heads and see what is going on behind them. There is a fire outside, and inside the cave, between the fire and behind them, and there is there are people moving around with objects that throw their shadows on the cave wall in front of them. All the prisoners can see are the shadows thrown on the walls of the cave and some sounds that they associate with the names of the objects that they see, ostensibly uttered by the shadows. And these shadows on the wall are there before them are all that they see, and the sounds that they hear, these constitute their reality. Socrates then asks Glaucon to suppose that some prisoners are released and see the fire as the fire, and then gradually the sun outside, that is the ultimate reality. They can now see things as they are. In Socrates' telling, they are the philosophers who now know true reality. The shadows that they had been seeing when inside the cave, Socrates argues, was a distorted reality. But once out, the people who have been released can, with the help of reason, understand truth. Truth and reason are the universal attributes of the soul that are already there in all human beings, so that all can, once they see the true light of philosophical reason, will know what the reality is. But in the allegory of the cave, things are not quite so simple. Socrates then asks Glaucon to imagine, and this is where we get into our territory, asks Glaucon to imagine further that the prisoners who have come out and seen the light outside are initially blinded by it, and it takes some time once their eyes are attuned to seeing the fire and all else, that they can eventually see the sun. Now, if these people were to go back inside, their return to the cave will not be easy, for now they must readjust their visions once again to the darkness inside. But imagine now if they tried to tell the inmates of the cave, the other prisoners, the truth. In other words, tell them that they are actually living in an illusory world. Would they not become objects of ridicule of those who have come to believe that what they see is reality itself? In the Enlightenment paradigm, the philosopher who is thus liberated by truth and reason has thus a pedagogical mission of liberating the rest of humanity from its shackles, of educating them. But others, of course, as Socrates and Plato are able to see clearly, are not simply waiting to be educated. Even though the soul has this immanent quality of attaining to the truth and reason, the road is far rockier than one once imagined. In different forms, in different ways, the question has been thus with us since Plato, who wrote this text towards the end of the 4th century BCE. And is a dialogue between philosophers, and the question of the dialogue between the philosophers and the masses, the enlightened and the unenlightened, etc., are palpable living questions even today. The 12th century philosopher Ibn Rushd, also known as Averroes in his Latinized name, too encountered this problem. that is like 16 centuries after Plato, encountered this problem and argued that perhaps where philosophers reached the truth through demonstration, burhan, and aql, reason, it was rhetoric and poetry that was perhaps the appropriate medium for the masses to reach the same truth. This argument actually opens up interesting possibilities which need to be explored, but which obviously it's not going to be part of my discussion today. But I think this problem that Ibn Rushd is dealing with already takes you away from that situation. It already takes you to a realization or recognition that however much you may say that truth and reason are immanent properties of the soul, it is not everybody who has that faculty. So in that sense, Ibn Rushd is making a distinction already between philosophers and the philosophically minded who can be convinced through demonstration and reason, burhan and aql, and others who perhaps have to be approached through rhetoric and poetry. But to return to a point, the subsequent liberal post-Enlightenment thought put the problem succinctly, if more problematically. You could emerge into this universal ground of truth and reason only through giving up community attachment. So now we are in like 20th century. And the same problem is seen by late 19th, 20th century philosophers, liberal philosophers, who are dealing with this problem, and their response is what? You can emerge into this universal ground of truth and reason only through giving up the community attachments and emerging as an autonomous, self-willing individual. In a sense, this draws on Immanuel Kant's idea of enlightenment as man's emergence from what Kant called self-incurred immaturity. That is to say, when man, and please, this man term is it's used by, it's not my term. So this gendered term, man, is how the language was used then. So when man ceases to depend on others for thinking and taking decisions, is the point at which you can say he or she has emerged from their self-incurred immaturity. Dissolutions of community and other markers that define particularity was therefore seen by liberal philosophers as the essential precondition for the emergence of man from such self-incurred immaturity, where he had to depend on the community elders or others to take crucial decisions in life. Postmodernity then is the condition of the coming apart of this faith of the moderns in the onward march of history and the telos of, or the goal of emancipation via the universalism of reason. In parenthesis, we should also note that questions regarding this faith had already started emerging in the wake of the 20th century experience of fascism, Nazism, totalitarianism in general. Freudo-Marxist thinkers like Erich Fromm and Wilhelm Reich grappled with the fact that fascism showed that the little provincial man or the uprooted mass man, rather than wanting to be free, was in fact afraid of freedom. He was afraid of taking his own decisions and facing its consequences, and therefore always looked for a father figure in the personality of the Führer or an Il Duce. But ideally, he did not want to leave community and religion, which were his shelter, which he was unwilling to leave in the first place, which is what liberal philosophers want you to do, that you must leave your community and other attachments behind. So postmodernity in our times is also the condition that plays out in the ubiquitous social media, where opinions and positions are now available in unedited format, unlike the monumental unidirectional vertical media of earlier times, newspaper, radio, television, etc., where communication was only one way. So these are often called the monumental forms of media, where there is only the one-way transmission, as opposed to now the social media, where we have horizontal communication between different participants. And this has made possible the emergence of an endless verbalization of opinions and the endless play of identity and identity claims, where moderns now feel totally lost in a sea of particularisms. My second reference point today is postmodernism, or more correctly, post-structuralism. Now, I should clarify at this point, make clear at this point that all these are actually linked to the question of how or on what basis we conduct a dialogue, right? So are there common bases? Are there bases on which we can actually say, okay, we agree on ABC, therefore let's proceed? And all these discussions that I'm referring to today are actually what complicate that kind of notion of a transparent dialogue or communication. So my second reference point today, postmodernism, has to do not with a celebration of identity, as is often mistakenly assumed to be, but a deeper exploration of the constitutive instability of our identity. Postmodernism, as theorized by Frederick Jameson and others, refers primarily to an aesthetic, rather anti-aesthetic movement or tendency that appears in the domain of art and architecture as an ironic mocking of high art and a move towards the more popular kitsch. In Jameson's rendering, it is given a specifically Marxist inflection by seeing the turn as an expression of the cultural logic of late capitalism. This in itself is a fascinating area, but is not going to interest me today, so I want to set it aside. I'm interested rather in what Jacques Derrida has called the metaphysics of presence. The most important question here is Derrida's interrogation of the idea of presence, of meaning and identity. That is to say, presence of identity and presence of meaning. The Western metaphysical tradition, says Derrida, has always prioritized speech over writing, in the sense that while the written text always involves a distance, so we should not confuse this with the general idea that speech is more primitive and the writing is more advanced and progressive, and therefore oral societies, we often talk of orality as a kind of pre-literate or more backward form. That's not what Derrida is talking about. He's talking about the metaphysical issue here. Distance with Western metaphysical tradition has always prioritized speech over writing, in the sense that while the written text always involves a distance between the addresser and the addressee, the speech situation is assumed to be radically different because of the co-presence of both. Because both parties are in dialogue are present, the assumption is that there can be a proper conversation where meaning of each is clear to the other. This involves, according to Derrida, an assumption of the self-presence of meaning. That meaning, in a sense, is present in a transparent way in the utterance, in what you say. Derrida's larger argument is premised on his critique of philosophy and philosophy's tendency to think of questions of truth, reality, and being in terms of presence, essence, identity, and such categories. So what he's basically saying is that if you look at, and it will become clear in a minute when I elaborate it further, but what he's saying is that this understanding or this idea that what you see is already there and in some way transparent to you, that idea of presence, whether it is an object or whether it is an idea or a utterance, this is an uninterrogated assumption which we have carried, or the metaphysics Western tradition has also carried for a long time. We can conclude from his argument, so absence and difference here acquire a key role in Derrida's philosophy, as opposed to identity and essence and presence, absence and difference, right? uh, we can conclude from his argument that however close to ideal a speech situation may be, the meaning is always deferred, delayed, postponed, for there is no speaking subject who controls all meaning, but the language and the infinite play of signifiers and the linguistic conventions. So in a way, this is also about what he's talking about. We won't go into the more complicated part of the metaphysical discussion that this requires, but you should look at it in this sense, and that when we talk of something, as he would argue about reading a text, that when you talk about a text, or when you read a text, or when you listen to somebody talking, what is important is not just what is being said in the text or what is being said in the speech. What is not said, or what is kind of would have been said but crossed out. So in a sense, every speech contains all these, even when it is presented to you in a formal published format where you have cleaned out every bit of when you're writing. All of you know that when you're writing, you scratch out, you write something, you scratch out. So there is always this play of what terms you're using, what words you actually finally decide to use. Many authors you will find in their subsequent revisiting of an earlier text will change one word from this to that. Now, that one word makes some difference. So what Derrida is saying is that a text is not, it's not that the meaning is there. Now, if you actually read Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, I'm bringing in this reference because it's very interesting that when Gandhi in Hind Swaraj and in his discussions of the Gita, he talks about the poetic meaning of Gita. So if you, many of you might be aware that in the early 20th century, there was a major debate within Indian thinkers, Indian intellectuals on the Gita. And it was not really a debate in that sense. I think what was happening was a large number of people from Bankim Chandra Chatterjee in Bengal to Lokmanya Tilak, what's his name, Bal Gangadhar Tilak in Maharashtra, and various other people were actually reading and commenting on the Gita for another reason, which is not directly relevant to our question today, which is the problem of action, karma. But they were kind of reinterpreting karma as action. But what they were also doing was to make the literal discourse of Gita, where Krishna is exhorting Arjuna to go into war, and Arjuna is resisting. He does not want to fight his relatives. So Krishna is basically telling Arjuna, you have to go into war because you are not the one who's deciding. You are only the nimitta. You are only the medium through which the purpose of destiny is carried out, and so on and so forth. What Gandhi is doing is, in fact, he's saying, look, you cannot read it literally. The meaning of Gita is not just in its words. So in a way, what Gandhi is saying is also what Derrida in a philosophical context is saying this is, you have to do a poetic reading. You have to understand the intent of the author. You have to, not the intent of the author, you have to understand the meanings that a text like Gita may acquire, which were not intended by the author also sometimes, but sometimes may be part of its intent, but which are not put in exactly those words. So what is it? Gandhi's reading of the Gita is that it is not a war between two armies. Gita actually is a reflection on the war that continuously goes on inside the human chitta, between the between evil and the good. So he makes it a kind of completely different metaphysical exercise where the voice that is exhorting you to go to war and the voice that is resisting the war, etc., these are voices within. And so now this is a completely unintended meaning or reading of a text. And in a sense, this is what Derrida really means by saying, when he says, he uses the term différance. Différance in French would be written with an A, D-I-F-F-E-R-A-N-C-E. And this is a term he coins to include two aspects of it. One is difference, which is to differ, which is not identity, right? So identity is to be the same, differ is differ. And he's saying that to differ is already to differ because there is already a delay in it, already what is not me is already an other, which is, there is a temporal difference, distance also there. So there is also, I may understand my meaning, but the minute I produce, it is a question of a difference, then meaning is already deferred. So what is being said and not said, that is the question that eventually has to be addressed and understood by looking at not just the manifest statements and sentences and words in the text, but by the silences and the absences and the blanks in the text as well. So the modern faith in dialogue. The modern faith in dialogue and conversation arises from a series of assumptions. First and foremost is the idea of the transparency and self-presence of meaning, which would ostensibly make the dialogue move towards a desired end, like evolution of some kind of mutual understanding. The second assumption is that there is a certain common minimum of a shared ground from where we can proceed. So transparency and self-presence. The second assumption is the common minimum of a shared ground from where we can proceed. After all, intelligibility is a function of that shared common ground. Third assumption is that there is a common language of communication. And even when there isn't one, there is a heavy reliance on what we can call the transparency of translation. What I mean by the transparency of translation is that A, there is a complete translatability between two languages within which translation or between which translation takes place. This involves a deeply problematic assumption about languages as mere media of communication, a point that completely ignores the fact that languages belong to and are constitutive of different moral universes, and therefore behind each language there lies a world. I'm putting this word world within quotation marks because it's not world in that sense. It is its world. It is that world, that cultural universe, that language that lies behind every language. B, transparency of translation also assumes that the dialogue is being conducted in a neutral setting where there are no power dynamics. Here we need to remember that while it may be possible in a formal dialogue setting to take care of various kinds of hierarchies at a purely formal level, as the example of Vietnam that I will discuss in a minute will show. In the context of such intellectual dialogues as of interfaith dialogues or dialogues among the enlighteners and the intercultural dialogues or interfaith dialogues between enlighteners and the masses, hierarchies are structural and inbuilt into the relations between classes, communities, religions, races, castes, or genders. In contexts like these, there is every possibility that the less powerful among them would not like to make themselves totally transparent to the gaze of the powerful. So here is an opacity that is built into the situation. So to assume that simply because we are getting two people to sit together, or two different cultural groups to sit together to exchange opinions or to talk in common, does not necessarily mean that you will that both will be equally uh, forthcoming in making themselves transparent to the other. There is a power dynamic where it might often be necessary, it will often be seen that it's necessary for or a resistance on the part of the powerless, relatively powerless, to not make themselves fully transparent. When I talk of the modern faith in dialogue, we must remember that we are talking here of the domain of modern philosophical thought. In practice, the situation from the onset of modernity was one of brute colonization by the moderns of the non-modern peoples and lands, indeed of entire continents, and of their genocide. And though different from the domain of philosophical argument, this too became possible due to the philosophical developments during the Enlightenment. For thereafter, there was no equality between different communities, their modes of being and thinking on the one hand, and reason embodied by the Enlightenment on the other. Reason was the final tribune, not only for deciding on what was right and what was wrong, but also on deciding what was the past, because it was irrational and which therefore deserved to perish. I'm reminded here of an episode from a Werner Herzog film that my senior colleague at the Center for Study of Developing Societies, Ashish Nandi, often recalled. And I'm quoting this bit from an essay of his. The film is called Where the Green Ants Dream. And the sequence concerns an old Australian aborigine who does not speak a word of English and barges into the witness box during a court trial, about to decide the land rights of Australian Aborigines vis-a-vis a uranium mining company. The man begins to deliver a long speech in an incomprehensible language. The shocked judge tells the lawyer fighting the cause of the Aborigines that he should restrain his client. The lawyer cannot, and he tries to communicate with the trespasser with the help of the other Aborigines, but even they fail. It then transpires that the man in the witness box is the last surviving member of an extinct tribe, and nobody in the world can understand him, or our world understands it. This episode actually lays bare many facets of the impossibility of dialogue in such context. In the first place, it lays bare the context of epistemic power. For in the new epistemic regime of the modern, the aborigine is not only situated hopelessly in the past, whose destiny is to go extinct, but equally importantly, in the new epistemic regime, private property, that is the uranium company, represents the most rational utilization of land, supposedly for enhancing the wealth of mankind within quotes. We might remember John Locke's notorious justification of the private appropriation of land. And Locke, you remember, is writing like in the 1600s, in the 17th century, where after recognizing that nature and God had given land to all of humanity, he went on to argue that God also meant it to be used by the most industrious and the most rational. So he who cultivated it had the right to take it over and make it his own. Now, there is a very interesting twist of the argument, which actually became part of an accepted logic of modernity. Land which is lying with the Aborigines or lying with these pre-modern people who live in symbiosis with that land, according to Locke, this is a waste. This is a real waste of that land. What the wealth that can be produced by that land is not being produced by it. And so whoever is able to produce it has the right, therefore, to take it over. And this becomes, in fact, the overriding logic of modernity in a certain sense. So, in this convoluted argument, we can see, especially in retrospect, that Locke found no irony in the fact that the person who cultivated the land was actually the servant or the slave, and not the owner whose right he was proclaiming. So there was always the question of actual power and subjugation of the person whose land is at the point of being taken over. Thus, despite the farce of a legal process being followed and the judge listening to the case of the Aborigines against the European Uranium Company, the scales are already weighted against the Aborigines. Finally, there is also the question of the language and power of the language. In whose language is the dialogue being conducted? Does that make a difference to how the dialogue will proceed? Complicating this further is the point that ties up with the first one. The language of power here is also the language that sets the epistemic terms of how the dialogue will proceed. Who is the addressee of the juridical courtroom drama? For whose benefit is it being performed? If we are to leave out this particular person who is the last one left of his tribe speaking that particular language, are other indigenous people really the ones for whom this drama is being enacted? Or is it for the benefit of the public of the colonizer country to demonstrate to them that everything is being done as per law? Now consider another instance. The Paris peace talks during the Vietnam War during the late 1960s did not involve such incommensurable epistemic worlds in conflict. On the one side was the Marxist North Vietnamese government and the Viet Cong, the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam. And on the other, the US and its puppet regime in the South. The peace talks themselves became possible only because the imperialist aggressors faced stiff popular resistance. However, after a series of obstacles were cleared through negotiations before the talks could even begin, regarding the location of the talks, etc., the last stumbling block was what came to be known as the famous shape of the table controversy. The North Vietnamese government and Viet Cong insisted that the shape of the table be round. The shape of the table was seen by the Vietnamese resistance struggle as key to the granting of the proper and equal status for them and for the dialogue to proceed in an equitable manner. The dialogues were not self-standing methods, so this became a major controversy, went on for weeks. And it's interesting because this is not some vague academic room exercise which was going on. It was right in the middle of a liberation struggle. So two things again are important and need to be noted here. First, the dialogue, the series of peace talks could only take place because the imperialist colonizers faced popular resistance that led to the liberation of the North, and the imperialist colonizers faced popular resistance that had led to the liberation of the North in the first instance. The dialogues, in other words, become possible and important when the power of the dominant is challenged in the first place outside and before the event of the dialogue. The challenge could be that of peaceful civil resistance, or it could, as has happened in a number of contexts, be that of the result of armed resistance. The second, the context and the actual setting of the dialogue must be, as the Vietnamese government demanded, equal even in terms of who sits where. That is the layout. The shape of the table controversy actually challenges this inbuilt hierarchy of the dialogue situation. The Vietnamese instance, as indeed that of all colonized societies who achieved their liberation through relentless struggle, illustrates something else as well. Reason is not enough ground for ensuring that a dialogue will take place in good faith. Reason good faith, there are interests and indeed racial and other prejudices that come into play here. So even though we strive to achieve a dialogue at different levels, we are faced with the problem of its actual possibility. Habermas, in his theory of communication rationality, has to deal with these issues, tries to deal with these issues by laying out the contours of what might be a genuinely open situation of dialogue. Habermas's attempt to redefine nationality as communicative, as distinct from either cognitive reason of the thinking subject or the instrumental reason of the kind we see in the instance of the indigenous person in Herzog's film, is itself a laudable one. So what are the two he's positing against? One is the Cartesian idea, the I think, therefore I am, right? So that cogito ergo sum, where basically the thinking subject is the center of the universe, center the whole world, and what gives meaning to the world is this subject. And so this is the subject-centered reason which came into a serious crisis in the 20th century, and around which a whole lot of critiques have developed, including post-structuralism and postmodernism. But the second that he's talking about is what Max Weber called instrumental rationality, which is basically the use of reason in an instrumental fashion for the exploitation of nature, for the exploitation of humans, and so on. Against this, what Habermas is saying, so in a way, Habermas is conceding precisely what postmodernism is saying, and he's starting from there, that both these models of rationality don't work. You need another model. You need a model which he calls communicative model of, or communicative theory of rationality, where a common understanding will emerge out of an ideal speech situation. It will emerge out of communication between different contending parties, provided you have an uncoerced and a relatively undisturbed, pure situation of dialogue. Habermas's attempt to redefine, so this is in itself, I said, is laudable. However, it does leave one wondering where actually one might find such an ideal situation of communication where there is openness towards the other, rather than an attempt to simply convince. It may not be out of place here to refer briefly to three kinds of debate that appear in the ancient debate and dialogue that appear in the ancient Sanskrit text, Gautama's Nyaya Sutra. The three modes of debate identified in the text are Vada, which is more like the Habermasian truth-seeking fair debate, Jalpa, which is wrangling to win. I'm using these terms used by Arindam Chakravarti, and Vitanda, which is simply meant to refute or demolish the opponent. And a lot of value is placed in the Sanskrit tradition on the first form, namely Vada, which is truth-seeking fair debate, as an appropriate mode for the quest of truth. Also relevant to recall in this context, in the context of the episode of the last person from the extinct indigenous community, are the observations of the late Australian anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose, who spent a lifetime working among the indigenous people, herself coming from the settler society. And I quote her, in Australia, settler descendants, this is because also remember the film, Werner Herzog's film, is about the Australian Aborigines and the settlers. In Australia, settler descendants are situated in damaged places. We bear the burden of the violent history of the conquest that has resulted in damage, loss, degradation, and extinctions that amount to ecocide. The brunt of all this wounding has primarily been borne by the others. A fair understanding situates us in the midst of damaged lives and damaged places. Having thus laid out the difficulties with the assumption of the universalist ground for dialogue, let me now turn to some of the attempts to find a way out of this crisis. Uh, and you will see how this shift occurs if in the first this thing that I take of John Rawls. So the universalist assumptions of modernity had started getting questioned from different quarters over the 20th century. But it was only after it politically assumed crisis proportions that it started being acknowledged. One telling example of the continuing faith in universalism is perhaps that of John Rawls. John Rawls' hugely successful A Theory of Justice, which was published in 1971, where he could write, I quote, "Everyone has a similar sense of justice. And in this respect, a well-ordered society is homogeneous. Political argument appeals to this moral consensus." How homogeneous a society did Rawls live in, where he could so easily proclaim that everyone has a similar sense of justice? For someone born and brought up in the United States of America, did he seriously believe that the white supremacists among the colonizer settlers on the one hand and the dispossessed Native Americans and the African Americans shared the same sense of justice? Here, I do not mean actual substantive questions in dispute, whether this is my land, your land, so on. Those are separate. We are talking here of the principles of justice. Were they to be asked to articulate what they meant by justice, would they all articulate them in the same way, the way Rawls thinks that everybody's sense of justice is the same? Even assuming the heuristic device of the original position and the veil of ignorance behind which people are supposed to be, where they do not know what their location in the social order is, would they articulate their principles of justice in the way Rawls imagines they would? So I'm not sure how many of you would be familiar with this, but in his Theory of Justice, Rawls actually conducts a thought experiment where basically he asks us to imagine that we are in an original position. So how do you design original position where we do not know what our position in actually existing society will be? Whether we'll be a woman or a man, whether we'll be a black or a white, whether we'll be a worker or an aboriginal, or we'll be lords and masters and so on, we don't know. So there is a veil of ignorance. And sitting behind this veil of ignorance without any knowledge of what your position in actual societies would be, how would you design a society, a just society of the future? This is the thought experiment that Rawls asks his readers to perform, and he himself performs. So the reference here to original position and veil of ignorance is this. And his point is that if you're asked to do that, you will all naturally have the same kind of proposals or the same kind of suggestions for what a just society, future just society would be, because you don't know where you will be, whether you will be a Shudra or a Brahmin. You don't know whether you will be a Dalit or a Brahmin. You won't know whether you will be a black slave or a white master. So you would then be trying to design a society which would be just in every possible way. And now, the difficulty here is, and this has been pointed out in various critiques of Rawls, that even if you don't know anything, there will be still people wanting to design a society which would be maximally beneficial to them as they are, right? But more importantly, when they are called upon to design a future society, even if they do not know anything about existing societies, will they think of designing a society that suits their own interests individually? Will they be these self-contained individuals who think in the way Homo economicus of late capitalism thinks? Or would they rather think along with others intersubjectively, to use a term from a some other variants of liberal thought. So liberalism now, if you just allow me a slight this thing, that liberalism primarily uh, prioritizes or gives ontological priority, existential priority to the individual. First, it's the individual, then everything else. So the Kantian idea of the self-willing autonomous subject, that became like the key idea of modernity. And later critiques, then liberals responded to those later critiques by saying, well, it is true that people do not think individually all by themselves, they think intersubjectively. So there are different subjects and there is conversation among them. So intersubjectively is the term they use. And what I'm saying is that even the term intersubjective presupposes and ontologically prioritizes the individual over the community. Whereas people belonging to individual indigenous or other communities might be totally at sea if asked by Rawls to think individually about what they should have, about what should be a collective good. Actually, even what should be a collective? Even if one were to invoke, Bakhtin, one could argue contra Rawls that meaning is always produced dialogically, which is to say that thought and thinking also proceeds dialogically. One could then say that despite Rawls's elaborate techniques to do away with any prior assumptions in the original position and by being behind the veil of ignorance, the way he thinks individuals behind the veil of ignorance will think is actually the way the liberal subject of capitalism might think, as a self-willing, autonomous, rational individual. Indeed, the subject that Rawls imagines is in fact worse. It turns out to be the subject of rational choice theory, who is invested in a whole series of beliefs that Rawls seems to believe are natural, including the right to property, which will completely escape our origin in the film. It is, however, Rawls's idea of overlapping consensus that he developed subsequently. So Rawls himself is thereafter moving towards a slightly more complicated position from that earlier one. And he develops this idea of an overlapping consensus in the 1980s in order to deal with the problem of stability, where he posits a multiplicity of beliefs. In a 1987 essay, he says what is needed is a regulative political conception of justice that can articulate and order in a principled way the political ideals and values of a democratic regime, thereby specifying the aims and the constitution is to achieve and to limit the limits it must respect. In addition, the political conception needs, here is Rawls now, coming a vast distance away from this theory of justice, that is a consensus which is achieved in which it is affirmed by the opposing religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines likely to thrive over generations in a more or less constitutional democracy, where the criterion of justice is that of political conception itself. The recognition of an idea of the existence of opposing religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines is necessitated not just by the criticism that Rawls had to face, but also by the fact that by the late 1980s, it was no longer possible in the West also to rely on what has been called an independent ethic, obviously universal independent ethic, to serve as the basis for dialogue across cultures. Rawls's problem was not about dialogues across cultures, but about the crucial question of how constitutional democracy, which is a question for us in India today also, of how constitutional democracy might engage with opposing religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines that exist in society. The idea of overlapping consensus, however, had a much longer life beyond this specific context. Since this was also the period of the emergence of multiculturalism in the West, which was based on the recognition of the existence of such a plurality of cultural communities and the need to find a common ground between them. Philosophers like Charles Taylor have discussed the importance of an overlapping consensus in a context where the possibilities of what he calls an independent ethic, which is obviously a universal idea from where you imagine everybody could agree on that and then we could move forward. So that is no longer possible, serving as the common ground, no longer existed. The idea here is that while people, communities with different religious, philosophical, and moral beliefs might disagree on larger questions, it is possible to find some grounds of agreement on relatively medium level issues. This agreement is what is called overlapping consensus, relying on which areas of common agreement can be progressively expanded. Habermas's idea of undistorted communication that will lead to common agreement is also an attempt to overcome the problems posed by an assumed universal independent ethic. While there is no assumption here of a shared common ground or overlapping consensus, Habermas believes that a genuine and uncoerced communication can still lead to the emergence of a common understanding. Lately, the question of dialogue has been raised beyond the context of national societies in the West or North. Widespread critiques from thinkers in the global South have subjected philosophy and the social sciences themselves to severe scrutiny for their continued Eurocentrism. The point has repeatedly been made by them that the continuing Eurocentrism of the social sciences and philosophy is actually a consequence of their proclaimed universalism, and it's not despite the universalisms. It has been pointed out repeatedly, at least since Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire, that the universal is always already marked in a specific way that excludes the African and the colonized. There have been some specific developments in political theory, for instance, in recent times, which have responded to this critique with the proposal to open out political theory to concerns that had hitherto been excluded from it. Some of these proposals call for deep listening on the part of Northern Western scholars to the voices of the scholars from the global South. Critics, on the other hand, have pointed out that this might be too little and too late, as the project of epistemic reconstitution of the human sciences now takes center stage. However, that is a separate debate and we will not enter into here. But to conclude, I would like to offer a tentative idea. Now, before I go into this, I think the problem with both the Habermasian and the Charles Taylor kind of understanding of overlapping consensus or communicative rationality is that both actually depend too much on speech, on talking. And I think that is where some of the questions that we need to think about might lie. Many of us might recall Buddha's dialogues. There is always a very important role of silence. Now, on a crucial issue, sometimes Buddha goes silent. He does not respond, or he does not respond immediately. So there are also ways in which you actually decide when and how to respond. And maybe you want to mull over a question, not respond to it immediately, maybe respond 2 days later, 5 days later, a year later. So, for example, Sudipto Kaviraj describes this, this text, Bharata's Natyashastra. It talks of 8 rasas. And then the 9th, 10th century Abhinav Gupta introduces a 9th rasa called the Shanta rasa. Now, Kaviraj's point is this is the time when the great battle between Buddhism and Shaivism is coming. And Abhinav Gupta is a Shaivite philosopher, aesthetician, that the great battle between Shaivism and Buddhism is coming to a close. But it has actually led to a kind of deep reflection within the Shaivite philosophers of what they have learned from this clash with Buddhism. And the Shanta rasa is a product of that unspoken dialogue. The conflict was in fact much more violent. But what has happened at another remove, at another level, is that philosophers who are reflecting on that clash are actually thinking of their whole aesthetic paradigm by including or invoking a new rasa called the Shanta rasa, or the rasa of peace. To conclude, I would like to offer some tentative ideas here, drawing, of course, on other scholars and philosophers. A very brief point. Actually, it's not a thing on which we have any solution. As to what could be a possible way of thinking about this whole question of dialogue in such contexts. Ernesto Laclau, in addressing the same problem of what a universal might be, makes an interesting suggestion. On the face of it, it may sound a bit like Habermas's quest for communicative rationality, though without any of the guarantees that Habermas seeks regarding the ideal speech situation. Laclau's proposal is to see universalism as essentially empty, as something that has no content of its own, and which can only function as a horizon to which we aspire. And a horizon, as you know, the more you try to reach towards it, the further it moves away from you. So it is a horizon to which you aspire, but which you will probably never reach. But that aspiration itself probably is productive. Yeah, it is something that lies entirely in the anticipatory there. Laclau, given his deep post-structuralist engagement, obviously does not nurture any faith in any ideal dialogue. His idea of an empty universalism as a horizon is not related in any way to speech and the speaking subjects addressing one another, trying to reach an agreement. Rather, one assumes in Laclau's understanding, it refers to practices that may bring people and communities together into a common project. Though this idea is not at all developed or elaborated in Laclau, I would suggest that the possibilities of moving towards the receding horizon of an empty universalism can be understood more fruitfully as something that emerges from being in common, since the lot of different communities and different people has been thrown together, especially in conditions of modernity. However, this being in common is not simply about being in the same place and same time. It is also about being in a relationship of non-hierarchy, where they share minimally some experiences, such as, say, having been or still being colonized. One could call these communities of fate, which may sometimes arise from a temporary experience of a threat, but they need not be altogether that transient either. The only way, it seems to me, in which any understanding can develop over time is through such being in common, where dialogue is no longer an event, a one-time happening, but a continuing part of being with and listening to the other. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Nigam. It was a pleasure listening to a lot of these things. I was noting down some of the things that came to my mind, especially when you talked about the language in which dialogue happens, and whose language. And there's so much of language politics going on around us. And I remember there's this series in which it's a very popular series where a girl goes to Paris, and then there's this conversation where somebody says that you can't there's always a misunderstanding because you don't speak my language. So yes, I mean, I think whether it's any kind of interpersonal or it is a regional issue, languages have actually made a lot of difference. We know also about how Pakistan and Bangladesh sort of so I mean, there were so many thoughts that came, but I would like to move to the participants, and if any of you have any questions, please go ahead and raise your hands, and we can ask your questions, please. Okay, Jay, please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. I actually, earlier in your lecture, you sort of, in passing, you mentioned how social media has essentially given us an overabundance of opinions, right? It has allowed everybody to express whatever opinions they have, and then sort of congregate around extreme opinions as well. So I just wish that you could elaborate or just give your opinions, give a little bit of more of your opinions on that.
Well, in a way, I would say what the internet has done, uh, and social media in particular. So let me just uh, if you compare it with earlier forms of media, the maximum that you would have by way of the voice of the listener or the audience or the reader would be either a letter to the editor or some letter to the radio compere or something. Sometimes it is read and published, sometimes it is not. And that also is heavily controlled. What will be published and what will not. So there was actually practically only one-way communication, whether it was newspaper, whether it was radio, whether it was television. What happens with the new media is that for the first time we are actually talking horizontally. Even before the emergence of Facebook, Twitter, and the social media, what we had in the initial forms, even with the appearance of the dynamic web and so on, and email lists and things, that there was some kind of conversation taking place across different boundaries, across different cultures, which had both sides to it. And it's not only a negative thing, because at that point, let me say, for example, that uh, a lot of misconceptions have been harbored by people across different nation states which are enemies. We are Indians, somebody's Pakistani, somebody's Bangladeshi, somebody's whatever. And there was no communication. We were basically only hostages to what our governments told us about the others. But with the coming of internet communication, social media, we're actually able to converse across borders. We're now talking to people and we know things which our respective governments perhaps don't want us to know, right? So that's one kind of way in which it has worked. It has worked in various other ways. But this particular thing, which has now become quite a malignant, taken a malignant form in the era of fake news and so on. So first it starts with, at a very basic level, this is the kind of conversation you could actually perhaps hear in a tea shop or a pawn shop or somewhere where people gather together in the evening and chat. And they each give their opinions. And anthropologists would probably go and try and look and search for such places where conversations are taking place to get those opinions. But now, social media has made it easily accessible across the world, not just in that particular locality. This also gives a disproportion. Then I'm talking now the negative side. The positive sides are also there, so don't assume that I'm saying this is only all bad and so on and so forth. But the negative side of it that has actually got enhanced is that it gives a disproportionate sense of the self. You think that you can actually, simply because you have an opinion, you can actually say it without any consideration for whether it's hurting other people or not, whether it is destructive of relations with others and so on and so forth. So this is the kind of thing which this kind of unedited social media communication allows. That is what I wanted to highlight here, refer here.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay, for the question. Jalil, please go ahead.
Hi, sir. Thank you for your nice session. I really enjoyed this session. My concern is uh, the Habermasian narration of shared common universal ethical background. If he's a postmodernist thinker, he just assert on a background, universal background for ethics. Then my question is, or my concern is, he just present resurgence of religion in his concept of public sphere. I mean, in the formation of the public sphere. Can we say these religions as a method or a tool for this, or a background for this shared common background for the universal ethics? In the sense of in the readings of the Habermasian.
Right. Look, actually, I think so. It's Habermas is not a post-structuralist or postmodernist. In fact, his whole project is against post-structuralism and postmodernism. So his book, Philosophical Discourse on Modernity, is actually an attack on all the post-structuralist thinkers. But even so, and despite his dearly held universalism, very early he has to recognize that both these forms of rationality are today not possible to uphold or possible to defend. The subject-centered reason of the Kantian type, of the Cartesian type, where the subject is the center of all meaning, and nor is obviously the instrumental rationality. So what he's looking for is something which is emergent, which can emerge out of conversation or communication. So communicative rationality in that sense, but the way he articulates it, obviously there is no consideration or space here of what the other, so including, for example, questions of religion and so on. I'm not sure there is a space for this in Habermas's own understanding. At deep down somewhere, what he expects is that at the end of the communication, you will come to some kind of universalism, which will be only another version of the universalism which he believes in. So in that sense, I don't think Habermas in that sense actually has a genuinely open communicative idea in that sense. So how much he may talk of uncoerced or pure communication situation, that is a mess he can't deal with. No, different communities, different religions, different, all of them have their own points of view. So that is made into an abstraction, basically.
Then, sir, can we say Habermas as a part of Enlightenment project? I mean, a modernist kind of thinker.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, then my concern is, then it's okay. Universalism is matching with the modernism and Habermasian narration. Then how he say the return or the resurgence of religion? The secularism was the part of the Enlightenment project. I mean the modernist project. But in the same time, he just make the concept of resurgence of the religion. I mean the return of the religion. And
no,
how
no,
it is
that is actually, it is the same problem as with Rawls. So let's be very clear. Habermas has said it in so many words, not once, all through his life, that what is wrong is that the Enlightenment project was never completed. So he always calls it the unfinished project of modernity, that the modernist project has to be completed. So in that sense, there is no doubt about it that Habermas, far from being post-structuralist or postmodern, he is actually a defender, hardcore defender of the Enlightenment and modernity, right? What he is acknowledging as in the post-secular is a empirical fact. It's like Habermas, that Rawls has to ultimately talk of over consensus, not because he's also equally a hardcore modernist, but there is a point at which you have to recognize that what you thought was going to happen has not happened. And so now you have, I mean, after 9/11, who can say, who could say in the best of their things that religion is irrelevant or religion will become irrelevant, whatever it is. I mean, look, 9/11 was something I'm not saying it is pure religion or religious garb, it is a political act, but which is in response to a certain kind of continuous imperialist plunder in the investigation and elsewhere. So that the fact that it is being articulated in the language of Islam cannot be wished away. And similarly, other religious languages. So his idea of the post-secular is only to kind of account for this, what they had not accounted for. They had imagined, they meaning the advocates of the Enlightenment and modernity had imagined that with the progress of modernity, all this will disappear. But it hasn't. It became, in fact, stronger. So now what do you do with it? So then you come with the idea of the post-secular.
Then also, sir, we can say about Habermas a postmodernist approach, because we can define postmodernism as a continuity of modernism, as you said. Can we say na postmodernism as a continuity of the modernism? It's not a counter narrative. It's not a another thing.
I wouldn't see it as continuity. I would see there is actually a very big rupture, and in any case, Habermas does not come on this side. He remains very firmly on the modernist side of the divide.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jalil. Janvi, you can go next.
Yes, sir. So my question was, as ma'am has also previously mentioned, that language plays a major role in having a successful dialogue, and that is when one of the topics of our conversation in the last previous sessions as well. Now, there have been a lot of situations in India where even between two states, like the most recent conversation I had with a person from Telangana, when I by mistakenly told that it's the same as Andhra. The hostility I could see from their tone. They're like, no, we are Telangana people. We don't speak like them. I'm like, what do you mean speak like them? It was not the same thing 20 years back. So every 100 kilometers, the language changes, and the hostile nature and the way they talk has also become very much, it should be taken into consideration, because in the more contemporary world we can see that we travel with respect to all of the things. Our language changes, our accent changes. That has been somewhere like been a factor of people discriminating against us as well, and they think that we cannot have a successful dialogue because of the language barrier. So what are your thoughts on it with respect to the contemporary world, and considering the situation between the interstate relations as well?
No, this is a very, very complicated question, because it's not simply about any given language. Okay, once again, let's kind of take recourse to or help from post-structuralism or postmodernism. There is no such thing as a language per se, in the sense that you're talking of Telugu. So Telugu was one, Andhra was one from 56 to sometime in the 2000s. And now again, there's a divide. And with that division, these differences in what appear to us to be the same language are exacerbated. In a way, I can think of Bengali similarly. The Bangla spoken in Bangladesh and the Bangla spoken in Bengal are quite different. Although in Bengal also, among sections of the Muslims, the language has a little more of the Persian-Arabic terms. So these are contingent formations. There is no permanence to this idea. So let's take the example of this. I know from a friend of mine who's so his parents, they all consider themselves Kannada. They all belong to the generation of the freedom struggle, his parents. and they considered themselves Kannada. But in the 30 years or 40 years since, Tulu started kind of distinguishing itself from Kannada. Many, and not just at a political level. I mean, in terms of writing, in terms of literature, and so on. The idea that during the period of the nationalist struggle, different languages which were like kindred languages merged into their identity into a Kannada identity. But when it started unraveling, all these started coming out as claiming their separate independence. It's a similar thing with Hindi. Hindi, in fact, is much worse off in that sense because it rode roughshod over a whole lot of what it called the dialects, but which were flourishing literary languages. Braj and Maithili and Awadhi, they're flourishing literary languages. They're not dialects of Hindi. But the nationalist project made them into dialects of Hindi. Now, all of them want their separate existence to be recognized. So that is a question which has to also do with the politics of language. And that, I think, is at that level a slightly different question from what we are talking of in terms of possibilities of dialogue. Let us assume that there is, even if you do away with this politics of the contingent formation, so that was what I was saying, part of my initial part of my talk, that postmodernism is about the constitutive instability of identity. It is not about identity. Most people confuse that postmodernism defends identity. No, it's not like that. And in fact, what we learn about it from about language, about other forms of identity, is that these are all inherently fluid, and there is no permanence to any kind of any language or any identity for that matter. So yes, what does one do with it in the contemporary world is a big question, because obviously that is where we are all trying to grapple with what happens after universalism, right? What happens once all that common ground has been taken away from beneath our feet? We can now not even recognize another Telugu speaker as the same. So this is the question of identity and difference, and to place everything on identity, therefore, is a little problematic in that sense. So how does one go about it? My last suggestion in the thing was that a lot of it has to do with trying to step back. Everything is not a matter of, cannot be settled in the modernist language of rights and dialogue and conversation and so on. Sometimes these conversations, as I said, have to be marked by silence, sometimes by withdrawal, sometimes by stepping back and deep thinking. It is not something which we imagine that we can sort out by sitting across the table and talking. Talking will sometimes only aggravate situations more, which is why I said that the Laclauian idea seems to appeal. He's not developed the idea, of course, but the way I read that idea seems to me to be more important, because it doesn't depend on talking. It doesn't depend on exchange of words. It doesn't depend on continuously verbalizing things. It is also about thinking about common practices. It is about being in common. What I am using this term, the term is of course from Jean-Luc Nancy, but I'm not really very much familiar with his work. But yes, the idea of being in common is precisely that when your lot is thrown together in certain circumstances, that is where you learn to understand each other. And that can only happen once you step out of this modernist arrogance that everything can be sorted out by dialogue, dialogue meaning by
Communication.
talking. But yeah, what I'm saying is, instead of dialogue as an event, as sitting across the table and talking, we have to think of dialogue as something which happens in the course of being in common. It is something which happens in the flow of life. It is something that happens where we sometimes may even withdraw from the conversation. We may come back to the conversation. It is not a one-time event. It is something which has to be seen. So you have to think of dialogue differently, not as a matter of speech, but as something deeper, more reflective.
Sir, and the example of Tulu and Kannada you gave, I relate to that very much because I'm from Karnataka. And talking about dialogue, you have also mentioned something about rhetoric skills. Now, reflecting back to all the philosophers that we have read, like Socrates, Cicero, they have very much emphasized on having a very strong rhetoric skills when it comes to having a successful dialogue. So, can we say that even without having a common language or a common mediums of speech, a person can successfully have it just with the art of persuasion if one like commits to it?
I don't think so. I think that actually that whole tradition, which is based too much on the, what Derrida calls logocentrism, the word, the like too much of the dependence on the word, it's not going to help. I think what our tradition, in fact, in some ways, I think Buddha's silence is actually very, very remarkable. And it tells you something, that it's not always what is spoken that is important. Sometimes this silence is necessary. It's not just strategic. It is necessary for deep reflection. And that cannot always be verbalized, or not verbalized at least immediately. It has, as I said, in the instance of Abhinav Gupta's and Shantarasa, it may be verbalized in a different way, in a different context, drawing on certain lessons of a particular experience. So, but I personally don't have that faith. I think, and modern experience has shown that sometimes talking makes it worse, because everybody's only trying to persuade the other person about the correctness of his or her own position. You're not really listening. At the very least, a dialogue is about listening, is about shutting up in some sense, right? So you say, okay, I want to hear you speak. Then perhaps you might come to something else.
Yes, sir. Thank you. That was all from my side.
Thank you, Janvi. Solomon, you can go next.
Hello, good evening, sir. Thank you very much for giving us a vast realm of understanding of postmodernism and, of course, modernism and things like that. My concern is in terms of, for example, a dialogue between a very highly structured bureaucratic organization and the say, for example, indigenous society, tribal societies. Now, in the context of, for example, displacement, maybe to make it much more understandable, to make it much more accessible to all the listeners. Now, two completely different societies altogether, in a way, two different sensibilities. A bureaucratic organization, a formal organization, a society which relies on a verbal communication, but on a certain standard, on a certain set standard, on certain morality. They rely on a particular morality of respect, of consensus, and of a relationship with the nature. And they've got a particular nuance of the languages. Now, when we come to this dialogue, this particular dialogue between these two groups, do you think what will the values will be at the center, or the power will be at the center? Where do they begin? Like, where do we begin? So that we come to a particular conclusion, like, which will lead to settlement of the people, settlement of their grievances and things like that. Completely leaving out the whole, the liberalistic understanding, whereas the whole bureaucratic structure is based on that particular rationality, Max Weberian rationality, and this particular structure is based on Weberian rationality, and that particular structure is imposed on a particular group of people. So where do we start the dialogue from? It's a real, very tough part to crack.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree with you.
I don't know if I am making it clear for you.
Yes, I agree with you on that. In fact, the whole example of the film was precisely of the indigenous person and the uranium company, was precisely that. And I agree that these are actually relations of power. There's no dialogue here. Even if you enact a dialogue, it will be a forced dialogue, because the terms of that dialogue are already set by the modern, the bureaucratic, the capitalist, and so on. So the terms of the indigenous people have no role in setting up the terms and the space for that dialogue. So there's no dialogue there. There's already a certain kind of, and that's why I said it is also linked to a certain kind of epistemic power. It is a power where already it has been decided that indigenous people are of the past, they have to perish. And only this land has to be used for mining, for all kinds of forest wealth and so on. So you have to clear it of people. All that is already decided.
No, philosophically, if we sort of reject the rationalism, liberalism, then we have to reject the structures which are established, as a consequence, as a fruit of that rationalism, isn't it? Socioeconomic structures which are established based on that, on those rationality.
Sure.
So in the postmodernism, multiple voices are allowed. In the postmodernistic understanding, the voices from below, the voices from, that is allowed. So how do we use this postmodernistic understanding in a way to come into the dialogue, come into the dialogue? And that is one thing. As you say that today, even for example, many of the countries, they reject the universality of the 1948 Human Rights Declaration. If they reject in the Human Rights Declaration, then where do we have the standard for dialogue between various groups?
Look, I will not go into the Human Rights Declaration and all that. That is a separate issue. I mean, because it will become a different. I'm ready to discuss it, but my point is, if you're actually saying that these structures have to be, that some kind of equality has to be established between different voices, then this modernist conceit has to be given up, and that can only be done by delegitimizing and demolishing it, and by providing equal space for all voices, for the subaltern voices or the non-dominant voices. As far as the Human Rights Declaration and so on is concerned, look, there is actually the point is not, it's not about that human rights are bad. That's not the question. There is a lot.
No, that's not the question. I am talking about the fruits of the
liberalism. What are the truths? Just let me now finish.
Okay. Yes, please. Yes.
So what are the truths we are talking about? Where there is a larger critique of humanism, and what does that mean? what was humanism? Sometimes you mean human well-being is humanism, human rights are humanism, everything that is about goody-goody about humans is humanism. But the critique of humanism is not that. The critique of humanism is fundamentally about this shift which comes with the Enlightenment after what Nietzsche called the death of God. Man, the gendered man becomes the new God. And it is with that you have a whole new way in which instruments of domination are set up. That domination vis-a-vis nature, domination vis-a-vis other parts of humanity, and so on. So even while you're giving out great declarations about human rights and so on, there are certain categories of humans who are not considered humans. And so it is not simply by saying there is a universal declaration of human rights. When Netanyahu goes and says the Palestinians are animals, that they are, or when the Radio Rwanda talks of the Tutsis as cockroaches, it is a way of delegitimizing it. Now, point is not to simply invoke some universal humanity. I mean, you can do that. My point is, I think part of the larger critique has to do with the criticism both of the idea of the human as distinct from the rest of the universe, other species. Here today we are talking of interspecies being and so on. And so this kind of sovereignty of the human or man is one of the things which is seriously challenged today. The other question is a critique of rights. Now, it sounds very strange to us. It may sound very strange to us if we are looking at it only at the surface level. But one of the things that rights does, and this is partly the problem which Janvi was, am I right in name? You were talking about, everything is not sorted out by rights. If you want to, so the discourse of right at a certain level in a certain context made sense. Even today, in certain contexts, it will make sense. But what right does is to entrench a certain kind of individualism. This is my right, and I will not yield to it. So there's no conversation possible then, right? If you have to have a conversation, you have to be open about the rights of the other. Your right may impinge on the right of the other. You say, this property is my right. It may impinge on the right of the rights of others. So it is nothing sacrosanct. There is nothing sacrosanct about the idea of rights. It is always linked to a certain kind of entrenchment of the self, which I've been arguing based on a lot of postmodernist thing, is that this self is itself fluid. You want to entrench it, you want to put it, give it firmly rigid boundaries. That is what rights discourse in a way does. Then it becomes hugely problematic in like if we look at the sharing of river waters among different states, a point you raised about the states. So what is the right about there? Whose right is it? A river flows through 2 states, 3 states, 4 states, even sometimes 2 or 3 nation states. Bangladesh and India are fighting over water. Whose right is it? Who decides the right? Where is is it going to be sorted out by right? That Tamil Nadu and Kerala will continue to fight continuously over river waters, or Karnataka and Andhra will continue to keep fighting about water by invoking rights? Or has it to be done by precisely the point is that if that river is flowing through, it's not that because it river comes first to my state, therefore I have the first right over the river. That cannot be an argument, right? So the argument has to then move to a different level, and it cannot be sorted out by rights, by invoking rights. But as I said, the thing about the critique of the Declaration of Human Rights and so on is a more complicated issue. It will require a much longer discussion. I have only kind of just pinpointing certain things. That is also in a way a kind of fallback on universalism. Okay, we have this declaration. Yes, we have, and there is some way in which it is valuable, and we invoke it in various kind of contexts. But at the same time, I think one needs to be aware that, like all such concepts, there are problems with these which one has to be. You cannot freeze them permanently.
Salim, was your question answered?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So since there are no more questions, Professor Nigam, I would like to close the session formally. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your expertise on this topic. And it was a pleasure to have you here. I'm sure all of our participants have enjoyed it thoroughly. So thank you once again.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.